relationship between the orbital debris problem and policy responses in the United States. Her advisor is Professor Michael Guerra. And
hi everyone, so I'm Kate Wilson. I'm going to be talking today about orbital debris. Quick definition, that is all man-made objects in orbit around the Earth that do not serve a useful purpose. So that's everything from derelict spacecraft to tiny flecks of paint that have chipped off from other spacecraft. Quick thank you to my advisor, Michael Guerra. He couldn't be here today, but he was great, especially in figuring out the intricacies of international law. And thank you to the Public Policy Department as a whole, both throughout this thesis process and generally in Stanford. You've been a great source of support. So quickly, I wanted to start with, this is the iconic Earthrise image that was taken on the Apollo 8 mission in 1968. This is, sort of the first time that humanity saw our planet from another celestial body. It's been called the most influential environmental picture in human history. But ironically, this was taken 10 years after humanity started littering the space around our planet with debris. I'm going to show you a quick animation now of how that accumulation has occurred since 1960. So that's a pretty dramatic change. Right now, of all those items you see in orbit, only 6% are active spacecraft. The rest is debris. And why should you care about all of this debris? Because of something called the Kessler Syndrome. That was first developed by physicist David Kessler in 1978. And it's the idea that once you reach a critical density of objects in low Earth orbit, you get sort of this runaway collision effect. So that even without putting new objects into space, you have an increasing accumulation of debris. And eventually that can mean that specific orbital ranges are inaccessible for generations and even cut off complete access to space for generations. So that means no cell phones, no internet, a much shorter internet forecast. That's a pretty significant impact. Briefly, possible ways you can solve it, kind of two categories of solutions. There's mitigation and there's active removal. Mitigation is about limiting the creation of new debris. It's about slowing the rate of accumulation, so it's really looking at addressing the problem in the future. The other category is active removal. So that's going up and taking down pieces of debris that are already up there, and that's about reducing the current problem. So that's kind of background. And now I'm going to go into my actual thesis, starting with the research questions, looking at the historical relationship between this problem and policy responses, and then going into the future. So, beginning with research questions. First, what is the relationship between orbital debris and policy responses to it? Next, what explains this relationship? That's the historical part. So having established that sort of historical relationship, what's going to happen in the future? Specifically, how will the entry of new private players impact the debris environment? And how will the relationship then between the problem and the policies change under these new conditions? So first, identifying the relationship. What is the historical relationship between orbital debris and policy responses? I started by looking at just what is the trend in the debris environment. This dark red line is the total number of debris objects since 1958. This is breaking down by type. You can see there's this very dramatic growth from 1957 to 1996. It starts slowing in 1996 to 2006. That's the blue trend line there. And that's largely in response to mitigation policies that were put in place by the US and other spacefaring nations. But then in 2007, you start having these really big debris events that kind of outpace the mitigation policies. That's in 2007, China conducted an anti-satellite test. They blew up one of their own derelict satellites and created this debris cloud around the entire planet. You had Iridium Cosmos incident where a Russian satellite collided with an American communications satellite, created a huge debris cloud. These events really accelerated the growth of the debris environment. So not only is just the amount of debris increasing, its impact on space activities is really increasing too. This shows the number of debris avoidance maneuvers that the International Space Station conducts each year. These are both, if they have sufficient warning, they maneuver the ISS to get out of the way. If they don't, the astronauts hightail it to the Soyuz capsule and shelter in place there so that if the debris hits the ISS, they can make a quick getaway. So you can see it's increasing. 2015 had 6 total debris avoidance maneuvers. So the problem's increasing. What's going on in the policy? The first US policy to address this was in 1988 under President Reagan, and it just said, let's minimize the creation of space debris. The next year, it added a provision asking the US to encourage other spacefaring nations to do the same. Increasingly, you saw in 1996, it's expanding the coverage. It's saying that the US will take a leadership role internationally on this issue. In 2006, you have the implementation of these debris mitigation standard practices for the US, and those apply not just to government launches, but also to government procured launches. So even if it's a private company, if the government is procuring it, they have to abide by the same standard practices. 2010, increasingly it's talking about littering the Earth's orbit with debris. It makes exceptions to those standard practices much more difficult. So the key thing here is it's increasing over time, but a key missing component is actually any private launches that aren't procured by the government have no requirements on mitigation. So you do have this strong increase in the orbital debris problem. You have a similar increase in policy responses. There's a lag there, so that the accumulation starts in 1958. You don't see policy responses until 1988. A large amount of that lag is due to the fact that it took a while for the problem to be recognized. David Kessler didn't write his paper until 1978, and it didn't really become widespread knowledge until a Popular Science article discussing it in 1982. So we have this positive relationship between the policy and the problem. But what explains that? Why do we have this positive relationship? In my paper, I talk about a couple different explanations. For the sake of time here, I'm just going to talk about the one that best accounts for it. And that is Kingan's three streams theory. This is a theory about how policy issues become considered, make it onto the political agenda. You have the problem stream, which is what's going on, what needs to be fixed, is there a problem? The policy stream, which is, are there policy solutions to this? Can we solve this? Political stream, what is the political environment? Is it favorable to addressing this issue right now? When you have all of those streams present and converged, you get the opening of a policy window for this issue. And then if you have a policy entrepreneur, this is some elite individual who's willing to invest time and resources into pursuing this issue, you have the issue really making it onto the political agenda and the possibility of action. So in the case of orbital debris, the problem stream and the policy stream are pretty present. I've talked about this. You have the accumulation of orbital debris. Policy stream, you have these general mitigation or removal policies. The political stream is a little bit more mixed. I'm going to go more into this. First, on one hand, you have a generally supportive public. The public is pretty supportive of the space program. This is a Gallup poll showing respondent support for increasing funding for the space program. It's very favorable. The public certainly does not want to be cut off from space. But you have some obstacles that make it difficult to do anything beyond mitigation. First, there's some pretty serious security concerns. There's significant military assets in space. US, Russia, and China are the big three in space. Together they account for 65% of current active satellites. And those three have large proportions of their satellites are spy satellites, are military assets. So as soon as you talk about active removal, having a craft go up there and start pulling down bits of orbital debris, that same craft can be used to deorbit components of spy satellites, and no military wants that. At the same time, you have ownership issues. Right now, under international law, every object in space belongs to the launching state. And that launching state is both liable and responsible for it, so if you want to start pulling down debris objects, you have to get permission from the owner. But who is the owner? It's the launching state, but the launching state isn't necessarily one state. First, it's a state which launches or procures the launching of a space object, but it's also a state from whose territory or facility a space object is launched. So if the US launches from the French facility in French Guiana, both the US and France can be considered launching states. Which one of them owns the object? It's not totally clear. So you have this convergence of the problem stream, you have the policy stream. The political stream is not fully there because of those obstacles, so you have really this partial convergence. You do have a policy entrepreneur here that's played by the White House. The White House is responsible for drafting the national space policy, but because you only have this partial convergence, you really have these limited policy responses that stick mainly to mitigation. So that was historically what's been going on. Now I want to turn to what's going to happen in the future as you have the entry of these private players. How will they be affecting the debris environment? This is an image of SpaceX's Dragon capsule docked with the International Space Station, and it's companies like SpaceX that are really already making waves and will continue to have a big impact on the debris environment. First, through lower launch costs. The space shuttle cost $10,000 to launch a pound to orbit. SpaceX's Falcon 9, that was the famous vertical landing in December, $2,000 per pound. Falcon Heavy is slated to launch later this year for $770 per pound. That means that the Falcon Heavy is going to be launching 2 times the payload of the space shuttle at 1/15 the cost. That's a 95% reduction in launch costs. And that's projected to go even further. You have Elon Musk, you have Jeff Bezos, you have these big players in the private industry who have very publicly stated that their goal is under $100 per pound. But that only matters if you have more launches going with it. So is the demand price elastic? There's been some work showing that it is. We have studies that show that a 75% reduction in launch prices results in a 281% increase in the number of launches. So academically, that's shown to be true. There's also just kind of become inherent in the trend in the industry. It used to be that a government would spend 10 years and $700 million to build this school bus-sized satellite. This was your Hubble Space Telescope that you launched, and then it had better last for 30 years because you invested so much into it. Increasingly now, though, we see this trend towards small satellites. These are the CubeSats, where you build 100 satellites, you launch them, they're $200,000 each. You make them out of prefab components. If one of them breaks, you just launch another one. So generally, the industry is moving towards smaller objects and launching more of them. So together, this means the problem is going to get worse. You have a greater probability of debris interference with active spacecraft. And this comes from 2 components. First, you have a growing number of debris objects. So that's just more objects to become debris as you have more launches. And also, that now that you have this trend towards small satellites that are using consumer electronics, they're not built to be durable because it's cheaper just to launch a new one when it breaks. So the likelihood of every object becoming debris is increasing. On the other side, because you have more active spacecraft, this kind of goes both ways. In the short term, this could actually help the problem a little bit. Currently, the US Air Force tracks every object in space. They track covariance bubbles around every object, and they issue warnings when those bubbles overlap, collision warnings. Right now, they're issuing a warning every 3 days. That means someone is moving a satellite every 3 days to avoid a collision. As you get more spacecraft up there, you have more precise information. So instead of tracking beach ball-sized bubbles, you're tracking more like marbles. So you can get more precise information about where those objects are and when collisions are going to occur. That has a limit, though. Eventually, you have so many spacecraft in space that you have sort of a saturation point, and you just have more craft for debris to interfere with. So we've seen that the problem is going to worsen. What's happening on the policy side? Specifically, how will that relationship that we've seen historically between policy responses and the orbital debris problem change now that we have these new private players? And here I approached the question a little bit differently. I started by looking at sort of what is the ideal solution. If you really want to solve this problem, what do you need to do? And then what is necessary to implement those solutions, and will those conditions occur? So what's an ideal solution? You kind of have 2 ways to do it. First, you can do a sort of state-sponsored solution, where states are responsible for removing their own debris. This requires politically, you really need one state taking the lead. This is what we've seen with mitigation policies, where the US was the first one to do it, and then you had a bunch of other spacefaring nations kind of following in their footsteps. Ideally, you really need to get China, Russia, and the US on board. Again, they're 65% of the active spacecraft. If they're not involved, you're not going to have a significant impact. Legally, you need to clarify who the launching state is so you don't have multiple states either trying to grab the same object or kind of trying to pass it off between them because no one can say who it belongs to. And secondly, you need to define what a debris object is. This is kind of surprising because there have been international laws discussing debris objects, but none have actually defined what constitutes a debris object. So before you have states trying to take things down, you need to clarify what they can take down. The other option is a market-based solution. This is where you have private companies removing or repurposing debris objects, and this works because an object in space is inherently more valuable than that object would be on the ground because of the cost it takes to get it up there. So politically, you need an incentive for states to relinquish responsibility. I talked to Export Aerospace founder Jeff Grayson, and he was in favor of sort of a salvage regime where states could declare objects derelict in return for no longer being responsible for that object. But legally, you need to make that possible. You need to reform international law so that it's possible for a state to transfer ownership. So what are some of the obstacles to some of those policy solutions? First, they're contrary to existing international norms and they require legal reform. This is especially a big deal for the market-based reform because what we've seen in traditionally in space law is that the laws that are very successful are those that codify existing international norms. That was the case with the Outer Space Treaty. Whereas when you have situations like the Moon Treaty that comes in and tries to establish a norm that is not already there, it's not successful. The Moon Treaty has not been ratified by any major spacefaring nation. So that's going to be very difficult, especially in the case of the market-based solution, because right now it's illegal for that sort of private company transfer of ownership under the law. Next, you need some sort of development of technical capabilities. It's very expensive right now to remove orbital debris. It's possible, but it requires fuel to move from debris object to debris object, and that gets very costly very quickly. So for any sort of large-scale solution, you need some sort of technological advance to make that cheaper. Next, you need some sort of way to address the security concerns. It doesn't matter who you have going up there and pulling things down. Militaries are going to be concerned about the fact that there's someone up there who could possibly interfere with their spy satellites. So is this going to happen? Ultimately, I think this comes down to sort of a cost-balancing equation where you're weighing the cost of the problem versus the cost of the removal policies. And without some sort of significant change, I think that the policies are going to be perceived to be much costlier. There are some things that could change that balance, and those are things like increasing the cost of the orbital debris problem. This is going to happen eventually with the Kessler Syndrome. Once we're limited in our access to space, it's going to be perceived as very costly. Before that, there could be some sort of significant debris event on Earth. Obviously, I hope this does not happen, but so far, the debris events have been pretty isolated. You have skylight falling in the Australian desert. There's not really any sort of significant cost associated with them. If we had some of those events, I think it would pretty quickly be perceived that this is a more significant problem. On the other side, for reducing the cost of the policies, this really comes from advances in technology. Once it's cheaper to pull down debris objects, removal policies become a lot more feasible. So, policy recommendations. Given that I think that cost equation is not going to come out in favor of active removal policies anytime soon, what can we do in the meantime? First, I think it's really important to actively strengthen mitigation policies. Right now, as I mentioned, those mitigation standards are not applied to private companies in the US. There's an easy way to do this. Private companies are already required to do licensing, and I was talking to an employee at Skybox, which is an imaging satellite company that was acquired by Google in 2014, and NOAA is responsible for licensing them, and in their licensing they have a requirement for a disposal plan. Right now that's just sort of, say at some point it's going to fall out of orbit and burn up in the atmosphere. You could strengthen that so there's some sort of standardization. It's not just show at some point that it's going to leave orbit, but actually have the same sort of, you need to do this sort of mitigation, apply it that way. Next, I think it's really important to have government-funded research into in-space services, which is orbital debris removal falls into that category. The commercial space industry kind of evolves through these market sectors, and right now in-space services are kind of a ways off. The government doesn't have that same sort of evolution. You see NASA, going to Mars, and they're developing what they need. They're not going sort of this progressive evolution. So I think that, eventually we're going to have the development of these capabilities, but it's better to have it sooner rather than later so we can start shifting that cost equation, and that's going to happen only if we have government support for this type of research. So I want to end with the Outer Space Treaty. This is the big law, space law. And Article 1 of this opens by saying, the exploration and use of outer space shall be the province of all mankind. Outer space shall be free for exploration and use by all. And if we want that to be the case, it's incumbent on us to make that so. Right now, we have had access to space for something like 60 years. It's our newest frontier, and it has the potential to solve a lot of the problems we're facing today. Things like natural resource shortages, overpopulation, but we're putting that at risk. Orbital debris is already a hazard to active spacecraft, and it's just going to become more and more risky as we go forward, eventually possibly cutting off our access to space entirely. There are 52 nations right now with at least one satellite in orbit. That's 52 nations who are at risk from orbital debris, and 52 nations who are moving a satellite every 3 days to avoid a collision. We went to the moon with one nation and less computing power than a modern cell phone. With 52 nations, we definitely can develop the technology and author the policy to solve this problem. we have the innovation, we just need to find the political will to give that innovation an opportunity. Thank you.
So my first question is, can you please tell us a little bit more about what I think you termed Earth debris events? So I guess that's satellites coming all the way down to around here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's been, I think that perhaps the most famous one is Skylab falling in the 70s. There is actually, there's the Liability Convention, which is one of sort of the suite of international treaties regarding this issue. And it has a provision for basically what you do to claim damage from an object, and that has been exercised only once, and that was when a Russian satellite fell over Canada. It was radioactive, and the Canadians used that to sort of file with the Russians and say, you're liable for this, you need to help. They worked out some settlement, but it's things like that. They've always been in very remote places, in the ocean. It's definitely causes a lot of public attention. One of the things I looked at my thesis, I didn't talk about here, was sort of what affects public opinion of space debris. And every time you have one of those events, even if there's no likelihood it's going to hit any populated area, you get headlines like, duck, the sky is falling, and things like this. And you get huge spikes in both media, like news articles, and then also in like Google search terms. So public definitely cares when it starts coming closer to home.
So space debris actually can come and like hit buildings around.
Yeah. Yes.
I mean, not what it will.
So your last quote sort of says, nobody has property rights in space.
Mm-hmm.
And so, sort of the tragedy, people don't have, there are no liability rules. It's not only open space, but no liability rules about what happens if my spaceship hits your junk in that, right?
Well,
and how would you change is there a way to get international coordination on the liability for space junk?
Yeah, so there is actually, right now, it's the launching state is liable. So that means that even if a private company, if SpaceX launches a rocket and it falls on your house, the U.S. is liable for that, but the complicating factor comes in the fact of, is there possibly multiple launching states? Like if it was no U.S. company, but it's launched from Russia or some other state, and so I think that the biggest part to that is clarifying the launching state, because there is a liability regime, it's just not clear who is responsible for that, who bears liability.
There was the collision between the Russian satellite and Iridium,
Mm-hmm.
and so.
So in that case, is it U.S.? Is it Russia?
Yeah.
Who is responsible? And the other hard thing is that, that debris ends up in space for a very long time, and so it's very hard if some piece of debris hits. You have a tiny little fleck that hits your spacecraft later on and causes a problem. It's hard identifying where that came from and who was responsible for the incident that created that.
You said, of course, correctly, that something that's functioning in space is much more valuable than if it were functioning on the ground, because you've got to get it up there. But in order to encourage, say, private salvage, you would need to presumably be able to say to these people, if you take this over, you can use it for whatever purpose up there, and then to do that you have to do something with other debris. And that might be one way to incentivise private collection of some of this junk. But do you think there's actually government support for the notion that we will pay private collectors to go up there and start stripping some of this stuff which is worthless in space or on the ground and bring it back, or some other way to dispose of it, collect it up in a big ball and jettison it into the atmosphere in a way that will guarantee that it burns up? But how do you see that? Is there any sort of enthusiasm amongst governments for the idea that we could try to mobilise the Elon Musks of the world to actually clean up our rubbish?
I don't think that there's, from the conversations I had with people in the FAA, I know, and these sort of various licensing bodies and NASA as well, I don't think that there's necessarily support within governments to pay private companies, but I definitely think that there is support for this idea of being able to sort of declare an item up for grabs and then be freed of any sort of responsibility or liability for that object. I think governments kind of see that as that's what they're paying is they're allowing this item to be removed and then they're retrieving.
That would then get back to Greg's question. If you take my satellite and bring it down, and then you sort of reverse engineer it, and there's presumably an awful lot of material, particularly in anything that was security related, that might be quite valuable, but you would never get permission to actually acquire that property, would you?
I don't think so. That's why I think it wouldn't be the U.S. says, all right, everything we have, anyone can grab it. It would say, here are the specific things. And I didn't touch on this for the sake of time, but I think there are definitely regulations, sort of things that you would have to add in to address some of those security concerns. I think maybe the idea of some sort of graveyard orbit where states could push the things that they want private companies to have access to into some specific orbit and then restrict the private companies to there so that they're not going in and grabbing even derelict military satellites and sort of reverse engineering that technology.
Makes sense.
Regarding the entry of these new private companies, is the government showing, the U.S. government showing any interest in trying to regulate them somewhat? And then also, are these private companies, any of them showing any interest
Specifically
in the
for debris
issue? Yeah.
I have not seen any sort of interest on the government in regulating it in their specific issue. The government is definitely very much in support of the private companies. You have the Commercial Space Launch Act in November that was really pushing any sort of government launch that could be conducted via a private company to be done so. As far as private companies, I interviewed quite a few people in private industry, and there was kind of this sense that, well, when it really becomes an issue, the government's going to take care of it. So for now, we're not going to try and cut into our profit margins to address this issue that is not really our problem right now.
Okay, you mentioned the problem with the dual use satellites. Is there any precedent in ocean laws, maritime law? What happens with, for example, warships when they go down? Do they get salvaged too, or are they outside of that scope?
I have not looked specifically into that issue. I definitely think that would probably be the basis for precedent. A lot of space law is based on maritime law or on Antarctic law. So I haven't looked specifically into that, but I definitely think that would be a place to sort of be able to address those concerns with some sort of precedent.
How much, I mean, isn't there a certain amount of natural attrition here? I mean, you know, gravity pulls these things in and we see things going across. Is the rate of burnup of these things as they get slowly and steadily pulled into the atmosphere, is it just so low relative to the rate of accumulation that it's not the baseline rate of burnup is just not sufficient?
Yes, it depends on the satellite, it depends on, you know, how high it is, if it's low Earth orbit, if it's geosynchronous. That's definitely one of the benefits of the small sat trend is that those are going to burn up faster, they decay more quickly. But then you have other satellites like Vanguard 1 is the US's second satellite, and that is still in orbit today. So it's definitely, it does have somewhat, it helps, but it's not enough to solve it on its own.
Okay.